In 1981, the music playing from this clock radio in the town of Belleville did not have a category. 30 miles from Detroit, 3 teenagers were listening to signals that would eventually define a genre. But for now, they were just sounds traveling through the dark. This graph shows the reality they were growing up inside. We often talk about Detroit's collapse as a sudden event in the 1970s, but the industrial data tells a different story. Auto employment peaked at 220,000 in 1950 and began a long, steady decline that hit 50,000 by the mid-80s. The population followed that same downward slope. The teenagers living at the end of this timeline didn't see the graph as a tragedy. They saw it as a source of parts. They reached into that declining line and treated the economic shift like a physical component they could use to plug one machine into another. In 1972, Motown Records moved its entire operation to Los Angeles. The city's biggest musical engine was gone, leaving behind a silence that the local radio stations were left to fill. Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson weren't inheriting a legacy or a thriving industry. They were positioned at the edge of a shrinking city, forced to figure out what kind of music you make when the traditional factories finally stop. Inside the remaining auto plants, the human workforce was being replaced by automated systems. The city was being rewired by machines that didn't need a paycheck or a union. This was the industrial scale Detroit was built on, massive, rigid, and increasingly empty as the robots took over the floor. At the same time, Japanese factories were producing drum machines like the Roland TR-808. Because it didn't sound like a real drummer, the 808 was a commercial failure. The machines were discontinued and dumped into the global waste stream, eventually landing in Detroit pawn shops at prices teenagers could actually afford. While the city's core hollowed out, a growing black middle class moved to the outer edges. This migration placed the Belleville Three in a quiet, isolated environment, a middle ground between the decaying city and the rural farmland. These musicians shopped from the same surplus technology that had displaced the city's workers. They were taking the failures of the global manufacturing system and using them as their primary instruments. In the late 70s, FM radio was a grid of segregated commercial formats: urban contemporary, album-oriented rock, top 40. Each box was sold to advertisers as a separate audience that wasn't supposed to mix. A DJ named the Electrifying Mojo broke those borders. He called his show the Midnight Funk Association, a nightly ritual where he'd ask listeners across the metro area to flash their porch lights, momentarily turning a fragmented city into a single, synchronized community. Mojo didn't just ignore the genre labels, he blew the walls down. He played entire album sides back to back, forcing audiences to hear records the industry said they weren't interested in. He put the interstellar funk of Parliament Funkadelic right next to the cold, mechanical precision of Kraftwerk. He was broadcasting a collision of Black American rhythm and European machine logic. By refusing to keep the records in their commercial cages, Mojo allowed a new synthesis to happen. The teenagers in Belleville were no longer just listening to entertainment. They were studying how these disparate sounds can be welded together. A local party circuit called Charivari created a demand for this futuristic sound. Middle-class Black youth would gather in church halls and YWCAs, dressed in high-fashion imports, looking for music that sounded like the technology they saw in the news. Around 1980, Juan Atkins met a veteran named Rick Davis in a music class at Washtenaw Community College. Davis owned a Roland sequencer, a tool that could automate musical patterns. This meeting shifted the music from a vision to a physical reality. With a sequencer, Atkins realized he didn't need a band or a studio contract. He could program every layer of a record himself, turning his bedroom into a one-man assembly line. Atkins and Davis formed Cybertron and launched their own label, Deep Space Records. They took the discarded fragments of the city, the data lines, the failed drum machines, and the industrial debris, and welded them into a self-contained music industry. Atkins found a vocabulary for what they were doing in Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Waves. He took the term techno-rebels to describe people who would use new technology to build their own systems instead of being made obsolete by them. Their first single, Alleys of Your Mind, sold tens of thousands of copies. It wasn't just a local hit, it was a prototype. It proved that a few kids with second-hand hardware could bypass the entire Motown system and speak directly to their city. By 1985, another failed machine, the Roland TR-909, had entered the mix. Atkins used it to record No UFOs under the name Model 500. This diagram shows the architecture of the track. It replaced the human swing of traditional funk with a clinical, relentless 808 pattern and a bass line that refused to stop. In a slowing physical economy, the record provided a much faster velocity. On the vocal version, Atkins sang through a vocoder. By adopting the voice of a machine, he was making a manifesto. He was arguing that even in a city that had lost its factories, you could still use the technology they left behind to see a way forward. By 1988, a UK compilation finally gave this sound the name techno, but the Detroit teenagers had already engineered the world that name described. This music wasn't a gift handed down to the city. It was what happened when a group of kids refused the silence of the wreckage and used the discarded parts of the old world to engineer a system of their own.